We come now to number 8 in our series on prophecy, looking at all the allusions, images and symbols there. And now we're taken into a very odd place for most people. It's in the Psalms, part 1. And we're going to look at part 2 next time. Psalms is not the usual book that we turn to when we're asked to talk about prophecy. Let's be honest about that. And in many ways, it's not exactly prophecy as we know it. It's certainly not prophecy as in the case of Daniel or in Revelation and some of the other prophets. But there's some very interesting elements there. Here's a quote. It can be difficult when only looking at the poetry of the Psalms to see where it is talking about Jesus' life and death and how he fulfilled the promises God made to Adam and to Abraham. Not every psalm is prophetic. Good point. The messianic psalms are scattered throughout the book. That was Bethany Verrett. And I think that as we look at the psalms, we've got to look a little deeper at what it really is talking about. There are some elements in psalms that are later interpreted as prophetic. For example, there's Jesus' quote from Psalm 22, and there are 2 more statements from that same psalm there in the New Testament. A comment from Psalm 110 that Jesus applies to himself. The last words that Jesus speaks from the cross are from Psalm 31. Both Peter and Paul quoted from Psalm 16 that Jesus would not see corruption, and John quoted from Psalm 69 that Jesus would be hated without cause. But as I say in the notes, if you really wanted to put together the Old Testament prophecy and the New Testament fulfillment, you'd be better off looking at a book like Matthew, for example, who spends a lot of time connecting up the dots between the Old and the New. But, here's a big but, on the road to Emmaus, Jesus says to those 2 disciples, everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms had to be fulfilled. What was said about Jesus in the Psalms had to be fulfilled. So there's a very clear indication that we are meant to read the Psalms in that prophetic way. Some people say there is no prophecy there in the Psalms. I would strongly disagree, especially when it's talking about the Messiah. Psalm 8 says that Messiah will be praised by babies. We see that in Jesus' life. He would delight to do God's will, Psalm 40. He will inherit an eternal throne, Psalm 45. He will pray for his enemies, Psalm 109, and so on. So even though there may not be absolutely specific references, there's a generic aspect to it which we should not miss. They're equally applicable to Jesus, even though maybe some people in Jesus' time would not have seen it that way. And they might have said, no, that's not talking about the coming Messiah. It's talking about whatever else the psalm was referring to. But clearly, especially the New Testament writers did see it that way, and Jesus sees it that way himself. Even when the psalmists are speaking about their own experiences, Jesus in his humanity identifies with them. So when David is talking about his enemies and how they're persecuting him, Jesus too would be saying the same thing, I think. He might not have been imploring God to deal with them in the same way that David did, but he would be very much aware of the persecution and what was happening. And so the experience of the Psalms does relate to the experience of Jesus and to other Christians of the time, and of course to ourselves today. As I say there, the thrust of the Psalms is not to provide chapter and verse prophetic promise and fulfillment. They're to give us as believers confidence in God's plan of salvation in the context of the great controversy. So as you look at the Psalms, as you read them, as you pick up these various elements, yes, there are some very significant ones. Jesus crying out from the cross, my God, why have you abandoned me? And things like that. And that ties you right back into the Psalms. But more significantly, they are the experience of God's chosen one and his people in the great controversy And as we look forward to the future, we can have hope in God, because it's the same God who saw God's people through in the Old Testament, who was with Jesus right until the very end and beyond, the ascension and in his return. So let's not miss any of that as we think of the Psalms in terms of prophecy.